866-957-2874. You're listening to Stacy on the Right on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
So grateful for our next guest joining us tonight to talk about this very, very important Wall Street Journal story. We're joined by Neetu Arnold, fellow at the National Association of Scholars, contributor with Young Voices at Neetu_Arnold on Twitter. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Stacy.
Oh my goodness. Let's start off with this. It's an unbelievable development. You have a Chicago school offering racially segregated classes for Black and Latino students. Is it before Martin Luther King or after? I can't tell.
When I read this story, I really couldn't believe it. I felt like we went backwards, and this is something that we've tried to overcome as a country. And so I really couldn't believe it when I first read that story.
We did overcome it. I'm here to speak from experience that this has been overcome, so I don't know why we're going backwards. What was the intent here?
So Evanston Township High School in Illinois wanted to address the racial academic performance achievement gaps between their students. Blacks and Hispanic students were not performing as well as Asian and whites, and so they thought that if they separated them into different classes, that somehow that would improve academic performance.
Did it work?
I'm not sure if it's worked yet. I mean, they just proposed it this year. I think what's unique about this particular program is that it is targeted towards core academic classes, which those kinds of classes are not voluntary. Those are classes that everybody has to take to graduate. And this kind of program falls into a larger initiative called affinity groups. They intentionally separate students based on an identity category like race, sexual orientation, et cetera. And I think usually with these affinity groups, they target more voluntary activities like extracurricular groups, or you might see them on college campuses with Black-only graduations or LGBT student graduations. So what was going on in this Illinois public high school was quite unique and shocking.
So I actually feel like, and I don't know, maybe I just don't understand this, but I would feel if I were an LGBT student and I had a graduation that was just for LGBT, that would feel as if I was being cordoned off, and that would be the opposite of being accepted.
I mean, I would think the whole point of graduation is to celebrate as one. You know, it's a huge achievement, and to just siphon off into these separate groups, it's quite divisive, and I don't know, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but here, this is where we are.
So there was obviously a backlash. Is the policies, are they still planning on implementing it, or what's the status?
I mean, I haven't heard any of the school's administrators comment on this issue, and it seems like they're going forward with it.
So the embarrassment will come later when they realize they were robbed of the opportunity to be a part of that larger group. Because there has to be a little bit of, I don't know, maybe the people who aren't included in the affinity groups kind of shrug their head and don't care. But I would feel as if a person who wanted to exclude me from their graduation because I'm not a part of their affinity group, that would also be someone who I would kind of exclude from networking in the future. I wouldn't feel an affinity towards maybe letting them know about job opportunities or, things like that. Because that's a part of what college is you meet people who later, you might say, hey, I heard that there's an opening. We have an opening in my company, and I thought of you because I know that your major was X. Are you in the job market? Or, the specialization that you had, or your minor was such and so, and we're looking for someone with your skill set. I thought of you. That's a part of what you get out of going to college, isn't it?
Well, yes, and I think since this is at a high school, I think it's teaching students to view things in a very, since it's had to do with race particularly, it's teaching them to view things in a very divisive way. When I was reading the Wall Street Journal piece, they justified this program because they thought that maybe Blacks and Hispanic students learn differently, and somehow that they can't meet white standards of excellence. Now, I'm not really sure what white standards of excellence means. I'm kind of floored when I say that. I really don't know what that means, but it seems very divisive. And frankly, if we're concerned about helping all students improve in academics, I think there are other ways that are less racially divisive.
So the big deal here is, and you're right, this is a high school setting, but it sets them up for they want the same thing in college. And Harvard has affinity groups. They have dorms that it's not a requirement that they're Black only, but it's called Chocolate City, this dorm on Harvard. And it's where the Black students can choose to live with other Blacks. It doesn't mean that a white student can't get a room there, but the insinuation is, if it's Chocolate City, that you can't live there if you're white or Hispanic, right? It's for Black students. So they're looking, if you're trained up in this kind of divisive ideology in high school, it will carry on to college, and that's where you can lose opportunities because that's where the networking occurs. And you also mentioned, so they assert that Black students and Hispanic students learn differently. That is the epitome of racism, that the brains of Black people don't work the same as the brains of white people. That's just, it's ludicrous.
It is. And, I'm not surprised that colleges have been pushing this as well. Actually, the idea of affinity groups, it originates from academia. It can be traced back to the works of academic William Cross in the 1970s on his work on Black racial identity. And so the idea was that affinity groups were supposed to promote a positive sense of racial identity. Now, I think it's questionable if we even want to increase such identifications when we are in a country that has had a history of racial tensions, and we're actively trying to overcome it. And it seems like this gets in the way of that. It promotes division. So, the fact that colleges are continuing to push this, and then it trickles down into, K through 12 schools, I think it's just despicable.
It is despicable. It also points to a larger framework. If they're teaching young people that Blacks and Hispanics learn differently, the insinuation there is you have to have something different in order to teach them. It means extra work. It will actually result in fewer opportunities for Blacks and Hispanics, because who wants to hire someone who can't learn the same as everyone else? They have to have special training materials. They have to have special this, special that. It's the dumbing down of a whole group of society who might buy into these wrong-headed ideas.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And again, I think that there are alternatives to ensure that all students who are struggling receive the help that they need. I would support either stratifying students based on their ability, so offering individualized instruction, or we could provide targeted instruction. And we hear about all these kinds of instances where colleges are offering, they're focusing so much on oppressor versus oppressed when it comes to race, and we see these kinds of programs in high schools. But I do want to present a positive example, where a school was actually able to increase their students' math scores during the pandemic. And I think this is significant because we know that schools across the country were seeing decreases in their math and reading scores among their students. And meanwhile, you have this rural Alabama school has a large number of students who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And this school was able to increase their these students' math scores. And they did it by using the students' test scores. So they used this data. They looked at the strengths and weaknesses of the students, and then they targeted instruction to make sure that students could turn their weaknesses into strengths. And it clearly paid off. And this had nothing to do with dividing students based on race. And so I would love to see more schools doing what this Alabama school did.
That is so good. So in other words, instead of this nonsense, segregation, et cetera, they went straight to the data. And then they said, okay, every single kid here is going to need an opportunity to improve. So how can we capitalize on that? How can we make more out of that? And then they did the hard work. But what you described is that's actually a lot of work. And it's easier to simply segregate kids into classes and allow failure to rule in certain groups instead of saying, you kids, there's a whole lot of work that has to be expended here. We're going to work hard in the classroom, but you're going to have to work hard at home. You're going to have to devote a certain number of minutes per subject matter to homework at night. And if you do that, you're going to see huge results. And tell the kids their brains are like muscles. Muscles actually get stronger when they work, right? You're not born with muscles. You develop them over time. That's what the toddler years are about. That's why toddlers have superhuman strength, because they're developing muscles that they then will grow. The muscles grow with them and they use them over their entire childhoods. And then as adults, we all take a different path. Some of us work on keeping the muscles we built as toddlers, and other people let theirs kind of jellify and become obese. But these are all choices we make. You have to first work the muscle of the brain and strengthen it and kind of harden it to hard work so that it can withstand the pressure and get smarter. That's how the brain actually works.
It's interesting you bring this up. I'm a pianist, and so there's this concept of muscle memory. You practice something over and over again, and this is how you can see people playing with their eyes closed because they're relying on their muscle memory. And I think this is a concept that can really apply to anything you do, whether that's academics, sports, music. Practice makes improvement. And, you brought up something that this is a lot of work for teachers to look at the data and to target their instruction as such. And I actually think that's worth it in the long term. I think I see a lot of schools just trying to push students on to the next level, regardless of whether they are prepared. And that creates more work for the next teacher, because now they have to deal with a student who, through no fault of their own, did not receive proper instruction. Things that could have been fixed are ignored. And so I actually think if teachers and educators and administrators really care about ensuring that we have educated students, I do think it requires time. I think good things require time.
Yeah, and the time it requires, some people will try and act as if it's not worth it or you won't get results out of it. But that's the kind of loser talk we hear from people who aren't getting anything done, right? Winners don't say, well, if I can't get it done in 3 days, I'm not going to get it done, right? It's not worth trying if I can't get it done quickly. It just is a matter of continuing to build and build and build. And you mentioned piano and muscle memory. It's so true. Like you can, if you talk to a person who plays the piano well, they will eventually begin to talk about the time they spend on the piano practicing. They learn new music, right? It's just unbelievable. So much time. You play regular songs, right? And then you maybe master a song. And so you have to keep going back and playing that song again and again and again, even though you've mastered it, or you'll lose some of that song. And it's about the hand formation on the keys and just being comfortable there and settling in and knowing that you have to apply certain amounts of time to your music every day, every week, and it's a continual thing. And the minute you stop, you begin to lose it. So it's work. It's hard work. And people they're too lazy to want to do it. I'm sorry to sound, I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just speaking truth here.
No, I completely understand what you're saying. And again, I think the people who say, well, it's not going to work, to that I would say, look at this Alabama school. Frankly, even look at a lot of the southern states. I think it was Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Overall, they increased reading scores during the pandemic because they followed high-quality research. It was phonics-based education, whereas many other states across the country, for years have scoffed at it. they've said, oh, phonics, it's not going to work. And, now a lot of schools are turning around on it. And so, again, I think as long as we have examples where it has worked, that gives me at least some hope that we can see some changes on this. But I think these sort of quick fixes and, frankly, some ideologically driven strategies, I really don't see that working in the long term.
Yeah, it doesn't. And I agree with you. So for people who are wondering about the affinity groups, they're not actually a new idea. And you wrote about this in your piece over at unheard.com, unherd.com. We have this linked in the show notes for tonight's program if you want to read the whole thing. But I want to highlight something that you covered here about affinity groups. You go into the long history of the concept in academia. People who follow critical race theory have long been talking about these so-called affinity groups. But the implementation of the groups, and you talk about it being at scale in public education, being a recent phenomenon. Can you go into this a little bit further? Because I think parents will want to understand this as well.
Well, sure. I mean, when I was reading this story, the question that came to my mind was, where did this originate from? Because this doesn't just, somebody didn't just come up with this in a vacuum. And so, as I mentioned, it does have a history in education, in academia, and the way it's spread today is through the colleges of education. That's where you have your future teachers, future administrators that are trained. And so, a lot of academia, and education is not the only one here, but they like to focus on racial divisions. They like to focus on oppressor versus oppressed. Some groups are just will be forever oppressed because of their race. And we start to see this in various courses. And, just to give your listeners an idea of what's being taught, at Harvard University, they have a course called Leading for Equity and Excellence. This is where future teachers will learn to commit your system to racial equity. That is what they say. Racial equity in this context is about equal outcomes across races. It's not about equal opportunity. It's about equal outcomes. So forcing a certain outcome. Usually that means, it's either lowering the academic standards, it's getting rid of honors classes, or we're going to penalize high performing students because that's going to make those who are not performing at that level feel bad. And, we also see these sort of racially divisive classes. At the University of Wisconsin, they are teaching future educators that white supremacy is inbuilt into the schooling system. And so imagine if that's what you're taught about the education system, you're going to think that racial disparities is enemy number one, and the only way you're going to overcome that is through more racism, through more racial discrimination. So these are just some of the things that are being taught in these colleges of education, and this is where future educators are getting their knowledge, and then it goes right into the classroom.
Well, the outstanding thing to get under our belt here is to put a stop to it, to absolutely put a straight stop to it. And that is done by knowing what's going on, which is greatly facilitated by reading the article that Neetu has written over at unheard.com. And then to actually say, I'm going to speak to teachers about this. I'm going to escalate. I'll talk to the principal. I'll go to the school board meeting. And I want these affinity groups ended, because the affinity group you want your child in is the group that they form of friends at school when they join clubs based on interests, when they join sports, when, they might be cheerleading or in the band. They might be in Future Business Leaders of America or a statistics club, math club. Those are the affinity groups you want your child in. Affinity groups that are based on innate characteristics are inherently racially tinged, and they cannot have a good outcome because it's like going back to the segregationist years of this country. They were horrifying. And so anything that is reminiscent of that or would bring that back cannot be facilitated. And we need to put a stop to it. I love the fact that you're working on this and talking about this and going around, not just the discussion, but the writing that you're doing. It's so good. Thank you so much for sharing your writing and your work with us tonight on the program.
Thank you.
All right. That's Neetu Arnold at Neetu_Arnold on Twitter. She's coming to us from Young Voices. We're so glad to have them sharing their experts with us here on Stacy on the Right. We'll be back with more after this.